It's 12:43 a.m. A half-empty popcorn bowl sits on the couch, movie dialogue humming in the background, and bodies sprawled everywhere, filling the room with late-night energy and laughter long after parents have gone to bed. In case you've never been, because not everyone has, such a setting is a typical environment for sleepovers, an adolescent weekend ritual full of social activities with friends and late-night escapades. Hello, my name is Tate Johannick, and today I'm going to be reading into sleepovers by applying a queer lens to parenting magazines in order to historically analyze aspects of the sleepover environment. I also want to thank Dr. Krista Benson and Dr. Jay Basilaire for their mentorship and support towards my project. I'm also currently sick at the moment, so please bear with me. So as a brief overview, I'm going to be discussing why I chose to do an archival sleepover study, unpacking the ways in which parental and social influences impact adolescent identity, moving into discussing my research question and hypothesis, exploring the theoretical framework and methods that I used, diving into what I found, and then wrapping everything up with the conclusion, and then opening the floor up to any questions. So why an archival sleepover study? So I am specifically interested in investigating the effects of homosocial spaces on adolescent sexuality. And I specifically chose sleepovers because of how they encourage self-discovery of identity and promote group transition into adulthood. And this is done by just the social structure of how the sleepover environment is set up. So it's situated in a way that is free from direct external influences, and is very liminal in the sense that it's usually, a like 12 to 14-hour period spent at someone's house, adapting to the culture of their home. And they occur during adolescence with the purpose of kind of practicing group socialization on a more intimate level. And so previous research I've conducted for my capstone revealed that sleepovers have a perceived impact on self-discovery of identity for queer adolescents assigned female at birth. But upon deciding where to expand upon my sleepover research, I was really interested in how time as a variable impacted one's capacity for self-discovery by queer individuals assigned female at birth in the sleepover environment. So I wanted to do archival research as a way to map a historical timeline for the homosociality of the sleepover environment, and determine the effects of parental influence on self-discovery of one's queer identity as well. So I decided to divide the stages of my literature review into three foundational questions I felt to be essential in later understanding my data. So the first question is, how do adolescents navigate sexuality and social expectations in parent-child relationships? So after investigating aspects of the parent-child dynamic, I discovered that in terms of how adolescents operate within social expectations, the use of firm control, reasoning, and support by parents contributes to the development of internalized conformity in socially competent youth. So this quote kind of shows that parents are very influential in their child's social responsiveness by having children react in accordance to the parents' own belief systems. And this influences their behavior, especially into adulthood, because childhood is a lot of where they learn, foundationally how to communicate with one another, and with society, with people as adults. And so in regards to sexuality, this is especially prevalent in the sexual socialization of individuals assigned female at birth, because they're socialized to embrace femininity and be resistant to sexuality in favor of more emotional forms of intimacy. And parents also have an influence in this process. For AFAB individuals, they're ensuring that their child follows acceptable social cultural aspects that are standard for female individuals. And when assessing direct conversations about sexuality, parents are often really dismissive of positive aspects of sexuality, like pleasure, love, and relationships. They really tend to focus on negative aspects and warnings. And this is for both heterosexual and queer children. So that's kind of like an across the board thing. But what this does is cause children to develop a really negative or fearful approach to sexuality. and affect the way that they navigate sexuality later on. And these sources demonstrate that parents have control surrounding the way children socialize, even in instances and interactions free from direct parental control. And so understanding the normative operations of the parent-child relationship is really critical to understanding its operation in the context of the sleepover environment, because it kind of creates a foundation for how there are expectations for the way children socialize, and how understandings of sexual identity are inherited by children, because that either gets passed on to their peers, or internalized in a way that impacts their own decisions and navigation process regarding sexuality. Awesome. So the second question I focused on was centered around the influence of language use on adolescence by parents and society. So I'm asking, how does heteronormative language reinforce expectations regarding gender and sexuality? So language itself is constructed using binary categories, such as male and female, straight and gay. And these categories assume that sex, gender, and sexuality that are terms that are not only like concrete and lack fluidity, but that they're cohesive. So for example, somebody assigned female at birth is assumed to also identify as a woman and be heterosexual. And this heteronormative language creates assumptions by establishing normative standards of identity. So what happens then is anybody that falls outside of these socially constructed categories is considered abnormal. And specifically when considering children and adolescents, sexuality itself is viewed as a topic deemed inappropriate for children, despite the fact that sexuality is a constant presence and an integral part of children's everyday experiences. And this exposure happens through heterosexual relationships in children's TV shows, movies, continued exposure to gendered language. We've all seen the shirts in the baby aisle. Absolutely. And so it shows assumptions by adults in society of normative gender and sexual orientation. And so refusing to accommodate for alternative identities within language means that non-normative gender and sexual identities have to privately negotiate their path through identity development and adoption, while often trying to pass as heterosexual in the process of figuring themselves out. And so this process not only demonstrates the need for more inclusive language, especially early on, but reveals the ways in which children and adolescents are continuously pressured into heteronormative identities and behaviors. And so understanding how language itself plays a role in identity is really critical to understanding in the context of the sleepover environment, because determining how the context and external expectations of the sleepover environment has shifted is done through analyzing the language use by parents in the articles I analyze. So it's really important to break down how language itself works here, because language is a primary communicator to how we understand each other and how we understand ourselves. So it's really relevant in terms of navigating queer sexuality in that sense. So lastly, I wanted to address how language and parental expectations towards sexuality shift when adolescents are outwardly expressive with queer identity. And to start, so upon coming out, children are less likely than parents to perceive a positive change in parent-child relationships following disclosure. While parents may perceive the situation as being indicative of a deeper bond of trust with their child, children experience a lot of anxiety regarding the shift of their relationship with the parent, even if the parent's supportive. And then another possible reason for increased anxiety on the child's part is regardless of the level of support provided by the parent, it's common for parents to grieve over the loss of the idolized version of their child. However, this reaction is shown to be improved with increased exposure to same-sex individuals or interaction with other parents who have queer children. And there's also a correlation between the level of support a queer child receives and the impact of external stressors on the child's mental health and identity development. And so understanding how language can also be beneficial to queer identities is really important, because it kind of does a great job of showing the ways that the sleepover environment has shifted to try and accommodate LGBTQ identities, which is relevant in my research. So this leads me to my research question, which is how does the use of heteronormative language in parenting magazines published between 1950 and 2020 influence temporal understandings of parental expectations impacting the sleepover environment? So I specifically focused on the time period between 1950 and 2020 because sleepovers started taking off in the 1950s and 1960s, and have kind of maintained an on and off relevance up until the present. But with the drastic social changes in how gender, sexuality, and identity are perceived and the way technology has developed, the environment looks very different than it did, 70 years ago. So I wanted to document as much of that change as possible. And in analyzing heteronormative language through these articles, I think it definitely is the best approach because language itself is such a big way in which societal expectations and pressures are communicated. And because parents are primary communicators, I wanted each time period to be defined by how individuals were expected to follow more normative behaviors and the ways that parents reinforce that. So for my methods, I did an archival analysis of 21 sleepover articles either advertised to or written by parents between 1950 and 2020. I used both print sources and online articles because beginning around 2012, many magazines and paper news sources ended up shifting to digital platforms. And I also had limited in-person access to archives due to COVID. And so all of my sources were coded using grounded theory analysis to determine patterns within the data without kind of having any preconceived notions because the topic itself was really new to me. And then lastly, I developed the text into 5 themes. So there was surviving sleepovers, which focused on articles describing sleepovers by parents as more chaos filled and inevitably out of control. So something that the parents had to survive. Co-ed sleepovers that negotiate whether more than one gender should be allowed at a sleepover. And then I broke it down into authoritative and authoritarian parenting styles. Because they're two commonly known ways of conveying discipline and education towards children. And they definitely showed the largest contrast in how information was communicated. And just to clarify, so authoritative parenting style is where parents listen and validate their child's perspective while also setting limits for the way that they behave, where authoritarian is more focused on discipline and gaining control over the child without really explaining or making sure that they understand why a certain behavior is wrong. And then lastly, there is LGBTQ sleepover articles, and they focus on how to approach the sleepover environment with teens who are knowingly out and how the environment may look or feel differently as a result. After individually analyzing each theme, I wanted to make sure no critical details were missed in terms of similarities. So I ordered all articles chronologically, which is the basis for the discussion section of my research. So I kind of used the 5 themes as a way of making sure when I was like generalizing those types of articles that it was done in a way that was accurate, in a way that was really perceiving all knowledge relevant to that specific theme. So sleepover eras, origins, and behavior is the first section of my research. And as sleepovers were represented, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, they were synonymous with more conservative values about women as caretakers and their role in the home. So a lot of the anxieties about sleepovers centered around mothers being able to control the environment rather than on adolescent behavior itself. Articles focused on this anxiety through hostile language, like referring to the group as yelling like soprano hyenas, or informing other parents to batten the hatches and nail down the shutters. Well, a lot of this language is correlated with expectations placed on women that connected their self-worth to their ability to perfect aspects of motherhood. The lack of attention to their behavior and instead on noise level and home conditions showed an expectation for children to conform to social norms instigated by parents. And so, without the overwhelming concerns of external stimuli like technology, parents had kind of a greater relationship of trust with their child, especially considering that parents were a primary influence for relaying information to their kid. And parents kind of perceive their child's ability to learn from the world as a combination of parental influence and external recognition of social expectations that kids picked up on through like school or friends. So any threats of homosexuality within the sleepover environment weren't mentioned, but I do suspect that they were concerned because of how same-sex intimacy was attempted to be normalized in almost a satirically aggressive format. Sleepovers in one article were referred to as an impending orgy, and another describing the most popular activity done at sleepovers being girl talk. Um, and yeah, so just the way that language is played with that really brought up a lot of questions to me. And this reaction makes sense in the historical context that sleepovers became popularized in, which corresponded with the AIDS crisis. And then later on, when sleepovers became repopularized in the 2010s, the technology boom. And so this is when parents really started to realize the threat of external stimuli on the internal liminality of the sleepover environment. So parental anxieties on sleepovers kind of became manifesting themselves in the mid to late 90s with co-ed sleepovers and substance abuse concerns being brought up to the forefront of sleepover conversations, with parents articulating this fear by defending no matter how much you trust your child, the world we live in is volatile and unpredictable. Um, And so one of the things I researched was why the sleepover environment itself was targeted and not behaviors or identities relevant to queerness. And I think something parents have had to come to terms with after attempting to regulate their child's behavior is that if children maintain autonomy of identity and make choices regarding development and socialization outside of the home, having more external concerns grants parents more control when they're unable to control what happens directly in the environment. Um, but they do have control over, whether to perceive boys as a threat or view technology as dangerous to the purity of the sleepover environment. And co-ed sleepovers work to generalize this fear because not only do co-ed sleepovers work to reinforce sexuality by assuming a child's sexuality and then punishing them based on heterosexual standards of engagement, but it kind of labels sleepover spaces as moldable and easily influenced. Um, while also applying heteronormative language when describing sleepover behavior to confront the issue of queerness without having to directly address it. And so this kind of started with the rise of more negative sleepover perceptions and authoritarian parenting articles regarding sleepovers in the US. All right. So next, I'm moving on to the popularization and evolution of sleepovers, which occurred between 2000 up until the 2020s. So one of the biggest correlations that drives my sleepover research in the 2010s is how, with the popularization of internet and social media usage, followed an increase in technology concerns within the sleepover environment. A major aspect of this change is because a rise in digital culture increased the individualization as well as privatization of the internet, which is relevant to queer youth because the internet allows children to become aware of identities beyond heterosexuality at earlier ages, and network with other queer teens to kind of establish a sense of community that has really done a lot in helping children feel more comfortable coming out in real life spaces. Because homosexuality is deemed inappropriate for children despite continuous exposure to heterosexuality from a young age, the internet kind of results in a discontinuation of this pattern. So parents and society can't really censor the presence of queer identities as easily as they used to. So parents who can't entirely govern regulation of queer information and resources instead opt for an elimination of, like cell phones at sleepovers or like technology altogether. There are obviously other concerns to this, like, like possible pornographic exposure or cyberbullying. One sleepover article mentioned technology being prohibited because you can imagine what kind of pictures can be taken in a slumber party. And this comment acknowledges the homosocial nature of the sleepover environment in a negative way, even if it's just passive, because it affiliates technology with queerness in a way that shows how, when combined with the sleepover environment, there's an increased potential for queerness in sleepover spaces. Another peak for sleepover article popularity is between 2016 and 2019. There was an excess of authoritarian sleepover articles in as social media independence and rates of LGBTQ youth only continued to increase. This resulted in a lot of parents restricting or eliminating cell phone use at sleepovers. But for parents who didn't choose to eliminate the presence of technology and wanted to focus on the more behavioral aspects of the environment, parents attempted to promote activities that either correlate behavior with biological sex or to reinforce heterosexuality or attempt to normalize queerness by rendering it invisible. So just to kind of show how drastic these polarities are, one article described the game MASH, which, for people who haven't played it, uses superstition to kind of predict the life someone's going to have, but it's very based around heterosexuality. So, like, especially for AFAB people, which man are you going to marry? How many kids will you have? What's your socioeconomic status? So it enables the social construction of heteronormativity while also encouraging its presence in the sleepover environment. And then in contrast, a homosocial activity that normalizes queer engagement that was also normalized by parents is like, playing Twister, where one article describes the game as forcing players into funny positions. And whether this is subconscious or not, encouraging intimacy between teen girls in an already private setting creates a connection between homosocial spaces and queerness, actually normalizing behaviors that in other contexts could be synonymous with queer relationships. All right. Now to look at what has changed specifically regarding queer identities. How has the way queerness been negotiated in sleepover spaces by parents, primarily through language, changed over the course of the 1950s up until now? And so with an increase of authoritarian parenting articles also follows an increase in LGBTQ positive sleepover articles and a more authoritative parenting approach on working with children to set appropriate boundaries regarding sleepovers. Just like this increase in out queer children has really had parents having to rethink how they traditionally think about sleepovers. One of the main concerns that parents of queer children have been asking is, should my child be able to have same-sex sleepovers if they're queer? And on one hand, parents are trying to protect their children from premature exposure to romantic and sexual intimacy. But on the other hand, it's not very fair to hold queer children to equal standards of heterosexual peers because they're being isolated from qualities of same-sex socialization environments that are really key factors in helping them not only distinguish between platonic and romantic feelings, but just like negotiating appropriate responses to emotional intimacy. So this actually ends up being really harmful. And so research suggests that parents who expand their knowledge on how to be supportive and knowledgeable regarding queer identity and negotiate with rather than against their child are more likely to establish a relationship of trust between parent and child regarding same-sex identity. And so this positive growth is demonstrated in articles that advise parents to avoid restrictions of developing connections between adolescents based on gender, when it is healthy for teens to be engaging with, a variety of genders and sexualities to kind of discover their own identity and learn to connect with others differently. And that this can be done, as mentioned, by working with the child. And this also helps avoid the parents assuming that the child's gender and sexuality, just in general, because if a child is queer, but they're restricted from hanging out with guy friends, say the kid doesn't experience any attraction to boys, it still makes it that much harder to distinguish between romantic and platonic attraction in same-sex settings because they don't have anything to compare the platonic feelings to. And they can have, like platonic same-sex friendships, but it still continues to blur those boundaries and makes things a little bit more confusing. And so adolescence is such a critical time for initially learning self-discovery and having a more permanent perception of oneself. So children are more able to handle issues of homophobia and self-worth in adulthood when given the chance to experience sleepovers as a queer teen, proving that queer engagement and identity in sleepover spaces can occur in a manner that is safe for adolescents to navigate and falls within established boundaries by parents. And so to wrap things up with my conclusion, the three primary points based on my research findings are that across a linear time frame, sleepovers have shifted alongside evolution of queer visibility and technology. Parents have also attempted to gain control of the sleepover environment by encouraging activities and behaviors supposedly synonymous with heterosexual behaviors, leaving many behaviors to have homosocial queer undertones because parents can't erase the queer potential and nature of sleepovers. And so language is one of the ways that this is attempting to be controlled. And the results have been parents are unable to ignore how queerness is gaining modern day visibility due to technology. And this is forcing a conversation of appropriate integration of queer teens into sleepover spaces rather than invisibility. And so I've really enjoyed discussing the ways that the sleepover environment has changed over the decades and the impact and relevancy of these changes occurring through, heteronormative language. And I really hope to present future data on this subject soon. Here's my works cited. Perfect. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at the email below. And thank you so much for listening.